This map tracks the massive volume of energy moving daily out of the Persian Gulf. You can clearly trace the dominant flow terminating right here on the Chinese coast. For decades, the United States has relied on economic restriction to project power, but Beijing is countering with formal legal defiance, directly ordering its domestic companies to ignore Washington's mandates. This standoff forms a triad. The U.S. is applying maximum economic pressure, while China and Iran tighten their formal diplomatic alignment. The United States intends to drain Iran's revenue stream, degrading its war capacity. To execute that strategy, Washington is aggressively targeting the Chinese intermediaries and refineries that process Iranian crude. Historically, nations facing U.S. pressure relied on quiet circumvention. They used smuggling routes and dark fleets to bypass restrictions while avoiding direct confrontation. Beijing has dropped the quiet approach. By legally mandating non-compliance, they have shifted to active institutional resistance. This marks the initial structural fracture of the post-1990 financial order. This diagram shows the core dependency loop. Iran acts as the essential supplier, feeding directly into China, which serves as the critical consumer node. China absorbs the vast majority of Iranian crude, often purchasing it at a steep discount. This positions Beijing as the linchpin holding the entire Iranian export system together. That economic lifeline faces a severe physical bottleneck. The Strait of Hormuz is highly vulnerable to disruption. Roughly 20% of all global oil consumption passes through this single maritime corridor. The U.S. strategy has evolved beyond pure financial penalties. By deploying naval assets to enforce restrictions on physical transfers, it operates as a hybrid blockade. For China, this exposes a massive structural weakness. The nation relies heavily on imported energy, simply to maintain baseline economic stability. A disruption in the Persian Gulf threatens the exact fuel required to keep Chinese factories running and cities lit. Washington views its actions as containing Iran. Beijing interprets the exact same actions quite differently. From their perspective, these sanctions operate as a direct mechanism for the U.S. to exert control over China's foundational energy lifelines. This matrix outlines the architecture of China's resistance. It is divided into 4 distinct operational quadrants. In the first quadrant, legal countersanctions, Beijing implemented statutes that actively prohibit Chinese companies from complying with foreign directives. If an entity ignores a U.S. mandate, domestic law shields them from facing penalties within their own borders. This chart tracks the financial bypass. Rather than routing international oil payments through the standard SWIFT network, capital moves through alternative, yuan-based infrastructure. Settling energy trades in yuan ensures the transaction clears without touching a U.S. dollar. These payments are further obscured by secondary intermediaries and shadow banking networks, making them exceptionally difficult to track or interdict. On the diplomatic front, China explicitly frames unilateral U.S. sanctions as violations of international law, positioning itself as a defender of global trade norms. Meanwhile, Beijing maintains strategic ambiguity. They provide robust economic support to Tehran while carefully avoiding direct military escalation. The resulting system effectively nullifies U.S. financial jurisdiction over Chinese energy imports through weaponized noncompliance. This triggers a self-reinforcing escalation spiral in economic warfare, continuously accelerating the fracture of the entire global market. This diagram illustrates the feedback loop. In Step 1, the United States applies primary and secondary sanctions against target entities. Moving to Step 2, the target state formalizes its refusal to comply, legally blocking the enforcement. That defiance leads to Step 3. The originating power is forced to escalate enforcement just to maintain credibility. We see this clearly as Treasury Department mandates expand into physical shipping blockades, banking blocklists, and hard asset seizures. Returning to the model, we hit Step 4. Increased enforcement creates an absolute necessity for the target to expand parallel financial architectures. Which brings us to Step 5. The global market physically and financially fragments into distinct spheres. As this loop cycles continuously, every rotation shrinks the reach of the original unified system and drives liquidity into the alternative network. The U.S. is wielding its historic control over systemic access as a weapon of coercion. China is countering by wielding its massive economic scale and institutional noncompliance as a defensive shield. This feedback loop drives the evolution of the parallel system. As sanctions pressure increases, the necessity for a functioning alternative moves from a strategic goal to an operational requirement. This table compares the post-1990 system against the emerging reality. The old architecture relied on dollar dominance, unipolar sanctions, and U.S. maritime security for global flows. The counter system builds alternative payment networks, institutional resistance, and secure overland energy corridors. As these two systems solidify, the perceived legitimacy of international sanctions as a universal tool of statecraft steadily erodes. The immediate market consequences are severe: structural volatility, sustained spikes in energy prices, and the deep politicization of once neutral supply chains. International corporations are now caught in the crossfire, forced to navigate two entirely incompatible legal and financial regimes. Economic coercion structurally breaks down when the target is simply too integrated into the global supply chain to be isolated. The mechanical fracture of financial hegemony has begun, splitting the global economy into two competing and incompatible blocks.